One day I received a quiet message. I'm sorry. For everything. And then I replied only once. Some lessons are worth everything. I still remember the exact moment the air in the office shifted, not with sound or announcement, but with the weight of someone else's ambition pressing into a space that had never been theirs. It was just past 9 in the morning, and the sunlight was slanting through the blinds in those perfect golden lines that made everything look cleaner than it actually was. I was sipping burnt coffee from the chipped mug I'd used for the last 8 years, waiting on the usual Monday deployment glitches, when he walked in, like he owned not just the floor, but the idea of technology itself. His name was Chase, and in the kind of poetic corporate cruelty the universe seems to delight in, he had just inherited the company I helped build from the ground up. "Morning, team," he said with that cloying brightness that only comes from someone whose job was never earned. He clapped his hands, not loudly, but with that forced pep people use when they think everyone else is just an unmotivated version of themselves. "As of today, I'll be leading Vector Forge into a bold new future." His voice bounced across the open space like an overinflated TED Talk, landing with the kind of awkward thud only the newly powerful ever seem to notice. A few people clapped because silence would have been more awkward, but I just watched. I had nothing to say, not yet anyway. I had worked at Vector Forge for 15 years. I'd been there before the walls were painted, before the logo was branded into the conference room glass, before any funding round gave us legitimacy. I was brought on when the entire infrastructure was held together by shared drives and caffeine. My title didn't matter much then. Lead systems engineer, architect of integration, whatever sounded clean on a business card, but my role did. I had designed the bones. I wrote the security layers. I mapped every critical point of failure so we could sleep at night. If Calvin, the founder, was the father of the company, I was its spinal cord. Calvin wasn't a genius, but he was a listener. He knew what he didn't know, which is rare for a man in his position. He trusted those of us who kept things from burning down. When he got sick and started stepping back, we assumed he had a plan. He did. He handed the reins to Chase, his only son, barely out of his 20s, fresh from business school with a spotless wardrobe and no working knowledge of how our systems even operated. I'd met Chase once, maybe 5 years ago, when he interned here for exactly 3 weeks, managed to corrupt a QA database by deploying bad code on a Friday night, and disappeared before Monday's postmortem. I fixed it quietly back then. I didn't mention it to Calvin. I thought I was being professional. Now Chase was wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than my car and throwing around words like disruption and scalability like he invented them. Then came the line I'd been waiting for, dreaded and expected in equal parts. "Some of our systems are due for a refresh," he said, flashing a grin at nobody in particular. "We'll be evaluating who fits our new direction." That was the moment my team's eyes darted toward me like reflex. They didn't say anything. They didn't have to. They knew. I didn't get angry. Not right away. I just nodded, turned back to my screen, and went about my day. Around noon, the email hit my inbox. A calendar invite. 4 p.m., meeting with Chase, executive office. No agenda. No context. Just the kind of digital tap on the shoulder you get when someone's about to pretend your existence is optional. I accepted it without hesitation. I didn't bring anything to the meeting except my badge, my phone, and the weight of everything I'd built. Chase didn't look up when I walked in. He kept tapping at his laptop like I wasn't even worth the effort of eye contact. "Sit," he said, without tone or welcome. I sat. He finally closed his laptop with a dramatic snap and leaned back like he was about to deliver a TEDx-level revelation. "You've been here a long time," he said, dragging the word long like it was an insult. I nodded. 15 years. "Right?" he replied, tapping his pen. "So that's a lot of time doing what exactly? Keeping old code on life support?" I didn't answer. There was no point. He stared at me, waiting for a reaction. I gave him none. "We're moving in a different direction. Faster, leaner, more responsive. Frankly, we can't afford to keep outdated talent on the payroll." It took everything in me not to laugh. Not because I was shocked, but because it was so scripted I could have mouthed the words along with him. "You're done here," he added flatly. HR will contact you about your exit. I stood, calm. As I reached the door, I turned slightly. There's a clause in my contract, I said. Might want to check it before you finalize anything. He didn't respond. I walked out of the building and didn't look back. Not because I was defeated, but because I knew something Chase didn't. 5 years ago, after a security breach nearly cost us a federal client, I had asked Calvin for something rare in our field, protection. I told him, if I was to take full responsibility for every system VectorForge ran on, I needed legal safeguards. Together, with the company's attorneys, we wrote it in. If I was terminated without cause and without severance, I could revoke all administrative access tied to my credentials. That clause wasn't buried. It was encrypted into our survival. And Chase hadn't even read the damn contract. The moment I got home, I didn't scream or throw things or call anyone to vent. Instead, I opened my laptop, made a cup of black coffee, and sat at my kitchen table in total silence. I pulled up the admin dashboard that, incredibly, Chase still hadn't locked me out of. Part of me hoped this would just be a symbolic gesture, a warning he'd understand before things got worse. But then I remembered the look on his face, that smug curl of his lip like he'd just taken out the trash. That's when I knew there was no room left for grace. The clause was simple, powerful, and absolutely binding. If I was terminated without due process or severance, I had complete authority to restrict internal system access, revoke administrator rights, and enforce a security lockdown of all proprietary infrastructure. I didn't need approval. I didn't need anyone's permission. It had been reviewed by legal. Calvin had signed it himself. It was designed as a last resort safeguard in case of hostile acquisition or malicious compromise. And right now, VectorForge had been compromised, not by a hacker, but by arrogance in a tailored suit. I initiated the first stage at exactly 11:47 p.m. Employee credentials were purged from key access logs. Project permissions were revoked in real time. Communication platforms flickered offline one by one. The internal documentation server was made read-only and mirrored into a secure archive. I didn't destroy anything. I'm not a saboteur. But I pulled the plug on the illusion that Chase had any real control. Within 20 minutes, the company's entire operational backbone was paralyzed. Not permanently, not irreversibly, but enough that the next few days would become an education for anyone left pretending this place could run without me. By dawn, my phone had already started buzzing. At first, it was just emails with vague subjects like system access issue or login trouble. But then the text started. First from Marla in payroll, hey, I can't get into the portal. Is this some update I missed? Then Sam from DevOps, Jordan, did you reroute server access overnight? I can't see anything past staging. I didn't answer. It wasn't personal. But if I replied to one, the flood would never stop. They didn't deserve the fallout, but I wasn't going to be the one to explain what their new CEO had broken. By noon, I got the call. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. Then another. Then a message popped up from an old friend in accounting. Chase is freaking out. Everything's down. Board's asking questions. Did something happen? I stared at the message for a while before locking my phone and sliding it across the table. That silence Chase had handed me like a verdict? I was handing it right back to him, but louder. It wasn't until 3:18 p.m. that Chase finally called me himself. I recognized the number immediately and almost didn't pick up. But I did, because sometimes silence doesn't teach the lesson clarity does. What the hell did you do? He barked, skipping any pretense of politeness. I could hear chaos in the background, phones ringing, frantic voices, the dull panic of a floor with no direction. I followed protocol, I said calmly. Read the contract. You shut everything down, he yelled. You locked me out of my own company. Not your company, I said. Your father's company. You just inherited the seat, not the systems. There's a difference. He went quiet. Not long. Just enough to realize he didn't even understand what was happening. Fix it, he said, trying to sound authoritative. Now, you don't give the orders here anymore, I replied. You waived your authority when you ignored the terms you inherited along with your title. You want to be gone. Now you get to live without me. His breath hitched slightly, that subtle crack in composure I'd been waiting for. What do you want? He asked, quieter now. Is this about money? No, I said. It's about respect, something you threw away the second you called me worthless. You want the systems back? Admit what you did. Publicly. Not just to me, to your board, to your team, to everyone you tried to fool with that performance of yours. You think I'm going to humiliate myself for you? He hissed. I didn't answer. I just let the silence stretch, long and full of implication. This is blackmail, he muttered. No, I replied. This is justice. The systems are safe. Nothing's lost. But until I get what's owed, you're not getting a single line of code back. Then I hung up. The next 2 days were strangely quiet. Chase didn't call again. The board didn't email. The team didn't reach out. But every time I refreshed my anonymous RSS feed on tech industry updates, I saw the headlines stacking like bricks. VectorForge experiencing technical disruptions, rumors swirl around sudden system outage. CEO Chase under pressure after internal crisis. I didn't smile at the headlines. I didn't feel victorious. What I felt was tired, deeply, coldly tired. Because even now, I knew some people still thought of me as the problem, not the firewall that had stopped their incompetence from burning down the building. Late Thursday evening, another unknown number called. This one I answered. It wasn't Chase. It was Diane, one of the board members. Her voice was smooth, practiced, someone who'd spent decades being obeyed without question. Jordan, she said, we need to talk. About the systems? I asked. About everything, she replied. We'd like you to join a call with the board. No Chase. Just us. Today, if possible. What's the purpose of this meeting? I asked. To fix what he broke, she said. I didn't agree right away. I told her I'd think about it, then ended the call. And for the first time since this started, I allowed myself one small luxury. I walked to the window, looked out across the city, and felt something I hadn't felt in years, not revenge, not anger. Just clarity. I was never the threat. I was the foundation. And Chase had just torn out the wrong beam. I joined the call that Friday at exactly 4 p.m., sitting in my living room with my laptop angled just so the soft afternoon light touched only my face. I wore a gray blazer, tied my hair back, and reminded myself that I had nothing left to prove. The board appeared one by one in neat little windows. Diane, stern and unreadable. Marcus from finance, blinking too much. Lillian, arms crossed. 2 others I didn't recognize. And then, tucked into the bottom row, Chase, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His collar was crooked, his eyes bloodshot, and the swagger he used to weaponize was gone, drained out of him by failure and fear. Diane opened the meeting without preamble. Thank you for joining, Jordan. We're here to clarify the scope of your system access restrictions and to understand what conditions must be met to restore full operational capacity at VectorForge. Her voice was flat but careful, a tone meant to manage rather than provoke. I believe you are aware of the company's current state? Yes, I said evenly. I've been following the news. I assume client services are at a standstill. They are, she admitted. Government contracts are in danger. Vendor payments have been delayed. Our legal team is receiving notices hourly. Marcus leaned forward. We understand you were terminated without severance, and that your employment contract, signed by Calvin, granted you specific administrative rights. Correct, I said. The clause is listed under emergency continuity control. It was designed to prevent unauthorized access and protect company infrastructure in the event of internal misconduct or unjust termination. Diane nodded. And you executed this clause after Chase dismissed you? After he called me a worthless employee and informed me I'd receive no severance, I clarified, locking eyes with my camera. So yes, I followed the contract to the letter. Chase finally spoke, his voice scratchy, like he'd swallowed glass. I didn't read the whole contract. I thought it was standard. The admission was pathetic, but necessary. Standard contracts don't include administrator kill switches, I replied. And even if you didn't read it, you were still bound by it. That's not how contracts work. Lillian uncrossed her arms. What would it take to reverse the lockdown? Acknowledgement, I said. Public, formal, and complete. The silence that followed was almost satisfying. I want a letter signed by the board retracting my termination, acknowledging that the clause was valid and legally binding, and stating that the decision to remove me was made without due diligence. I also want a public apology from Chase. He blinked fast, stunned into silence. That's outrageous, he muttered. No, I said. Outrageous was being dismissed without a single word of thanks after 15 years of building everything your name now sits on. Diane tapped a pen against her tablet, thoughtful but not yet committed. And once these conditions are met, full access restored, I said. No damage has been done. The systems are safe, but they'll remain inaccessible until my terms are fulfilled. Marcus leaned back, exhaling through his nose. We'll take this under advisement. I nodded and ended the call without waiting for Chase's rebuttal. That night, I drove across the bridge to a quiet diner on the east edge of the city, the kind of place with cracked leather booths and drip coffee that tasted like 1998. Calvin was already there, seated by the window with a black notebook and a cup of tea. He looked thinner than I remembered, but not weak, just older, like the weight of watching his company unravel had aged him 10 years and 10 weeks. He stood when he saw me, offered a worn but genuine smile, and reached out to shake my hand like nothing had changed. Jordan, he said, I owe you more than I can say. I slid into the booth. You don't owe me anything, but your son might. He sighed and rubbed his temples. I gave him too much too soon. I thought if I let him fail, he'd learn something. I didn't think he'd burn everything down trying to prove he could run before he learned to walk. You didn't just give him power, I said. You gave him people, and he didn't care what that meant. Calvin nodded slowly. I want to fix that. The board is preparing a vote. Chase is being removed as CEO next week. He doesn't know yet. I didn't respond. He reached into his notebook and slid a document across the table. This is a formal offer, he said. Not to come back as an employee, but as co-owner. 40% equity, control over systems, hiring, infrastructure, and the authority to guide us through the rebuild. We don't just want you to fix what he broke. We want you to decide what comes next. I stared at the paper, heart pounding. Not from excitement, but from the strange, unfamiliar sensation of being offered exactly what I had earned for years without ever being asked what I needed. If I accept, I said slowly, I'm not coming back to clean up a mess just to hand the keys to someone else. You won't have to, he replied. You'll be the one choosing who leads us next. And Chase won't be a part of it. The next morning, I showed up to Vector Forge for the first time in weeks, not as a disgraced ex-employee, but as something else entirely. I walked through the doors in silence. No badge, no escort. The front desk staff looked at me like they'd seen a ghost. In the boardroom, every chair was filled, and Chase sat at the far end with his arms folded tight and his jaw clenched. Diane looked at me and said simply, Are the terms met? I pulled the signed apology letter from my folder, laid it on the table, and opened my laptop. I entered the root access command, restored permissions, and typed a single line of code. Restore_core_tree equals true. The system flickered. Lights blinked green. Access dashboards lit up like city streets. Emails began to pour in. Payroll reactivated. Clients were restored. Order from chaos. As I closed the laptop, I looked across the table at Chase one last time. He didn't meet my eyes. He didn't need to. The silence said enough. The first week after restoring the systems felt like holding my breath underwater, waiting for the ripples to settle while pretending nothing had ever happened. On the surface, Vector Forge was alive again, servers stable, payroll back online, client portals breathing, but beneath the numbers and dashboards, the company felt different. People walked slower, spoke quieter, and avoided saying Chase's name like it might summon him back from wherever he was hiding. He hadn't returned to the office since the board meeting, and as far as I knew, he hadn't spoken a word to anyone outside of his lawyer. No email, no apology, not even a passive-aggressive post on LinkedIn. I spent my days rebuilding the department from the inside, not with legacy hires or recycled talent, but with a new generation of engineers who knew how to code, collaborate, and listen. I didn't want worshipers or clones. I wanted thinkers, people who could build without ego and learn without shame. One of them was Tyra, just 24, fresh out of a small state school with a worn backpack and a brain like wildfire. She didn't know the politics of our past or the mistakes of our former leadership. She just wanted to make things work better. That was enough. I didn't take a desk. I floated, some days in the conference room, some days in the back corner of IT, and other days just walking the hallways, talking to people who had been invisible under Chase's regime. Janitors, assistants, interns, people who actually made the machine turn without ever being asked how they did it. The deeper I got into the guts of the company, the more I realized how close we had come to collapse, not because of any single failure, but because of a culture that mistook charisma for competence and titles for talent. Chase had inherited a company built to last, but he treated it like a casino chip. 2 weeks in, Diane called me into her office, this time not as an adversary, but as a partner. She poured tea instead of questions and handed me a sealed envelope without speaking. Inside was an updated equity agreement, signed by the full board. 40% ownership, permanent strategic oversight. A clause that gave me final say in all hires made at the executive level. It was official. My days of asking permission were over. She watched me read it, then said, "We don't want to be that company again." Not ever. I nodded. Neither did I. Chase's departure wasn't dramatic. No press release, no public firing. One day he was simply gone, his office empty, his name scraped off the door like it had never been there. A week later, someone from facilities told me he'd come in on a Sunday, packed up quietly, and left without speaking to anyone. He didn't even clear his browser history. The only trace he left behind was a note to HR asking for a reference. I didn't laugh. I just stared at the message and thought about how power doesn't vanish. It evaporates when people stop pretending you deserve it. Around that time, Calvin stopped by the office for the first time since the restoration. He moved slower than I remembered, his cane tapping softly on the tile, but his eyes still carried that careful fire. I walked him through the updated systems map, showed him how we decentralized control and cross-trained every engineer. No more single points of failure. No more castles with no guards. When we finished, he placed a hand on my shoulder and said quietly, "This is the company I wanted to build." It was the closest I'd ever seen him come to tears. That weekend, I went to visit my parents' graves for the first time in over a year. I brought a bouquet of violets, their favorite, and sat in the grass with my knees pulled up and my jacket zipped high against the wind. They had been school teachers, simple, brilliant people who believed in showing up, speaking plainly, and doing the work without expecting applause. They never understood what I did with servers and systems and firewalls, but they understood integrity. I whispered everything I hadn't said since the day I was fired. Not just the betrayal, but the way I'd found my way back without begging for it. I left the flowers, and I walked away lighter. Monday morning, I hosted the first company-wide meeting since the shakeup. Everyone gathered in the atrium, laptops shut, phones silenced, eyes forward. I stood beneath the old VectorForge logo, not because it meant anything anymore, but because it reminded us all what had been allowed to happen in its name. I kept it short. Some of you have been here for years, and some of you started last week. But no matter how you got here, know this: you matter because of what you do, not because of who you impress. Respect is not a bonus, it's the baseline. And no one in this building will be treated like a ghost ever again. They clapped. Not like a performance, like a promise. Afterward, I sat at my desk, still temporary, still mine, and looked over the blueprints for our next rollout. We were launching a new platform in 6 months, and I had personally handpicked the team to lead it. Tyra was on that list, along with 2 other engineers who had once been passed over because Chase didn't think they looked the part. They weren't loud. They weren't shiny. But they knew how to build. And that was enough. That night, I got an email. The sender was listed as unknown, but the subject line was clear. I was wrong. I opened it and read the 2 short paragraphs Chase had apparently managed to put together. He apologized, not for losing the company, not for being a failure, but for underestimating me. He admitted he hadn't read the contract, hadn't understood the systems, hadn't respected the people who built them. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, just acknowledgement that he'd finally realized what he'd broken. I stared at it for a long time, then typed 5 words and hit send. Some lessons cost you everything. That was all. No anger, no pettiness. Just truth. 3 months later, I filed the paperwork for my own firm, J-Core Solutions, registered out of Austin, small but growing fast. I hired my old team from VectorForge, the ones who wanted a new start. I brought in grads from underrepresented schools, mentored women in tech, held free workshops on how to negotiate your salary and how to spot toxic management before it swallows you whole. I didn't need a corner office or a vanity title. I just needed to make sure that what happened to me never happened to anyone else again. I saw Calvin one more time before he retired for good. He met me for coffee, handed me a signed copy of the board's final transition agreement, and said with a smile, "You did more than save the company. You reminded it what it's for." I thanked him, watched him walk away, and realized I had no desire to look back. not because it hurt, but because I'd already built what came next. 2 years have passed since I left Vectorforge for the last time, and not a single day has gone by where I wished I'd stayed longer. That chapter ended the way it needed to, sharp, sudden, and impossible to undo. I don't drive past the building anymore, not because it brings back bad memories, but because I'm too busy building something else, something I own. My days are now spent in a renovated warehouse on the east side of Austin, where exposed brick meets polished concrete and good ideas flow louder than titles ever did. J-Core Solutions started with 5 people, all of them people I knew could handle both code and crisis. We didn't try to look like a tech company. No ping-pong tables, no espresso robot. No slide from the second floor. What we built was structure, not theater. Everyone gets ownership. Everyone knows the budget. Everyone understands that silence isn't culture, and burnout isn't proof of dedication. We fix systems for hospitals, nonprofits, and public agencies, institutions that can't afford to be ignored when something breaks at 2 in the morning. We're not flashy, and we don't chase headlines. But what we are is steady, consistent, and hard to shake. There's a whiteboard near my desk with 3 rules written in black marker. Don't lie. Don't hide. Don't let anyone pretend you're disposable. I look at that board every morning, and I remember what it felt like to be erased by someone who had never built anything with his own hands. That memory doesn't hurt anymore. It fuels everything I do. Last month, a former intern from Vectorforge emailed me asking for a meeting. She's 26 now, working in cybersecurity, and told me she still remembers the way I stood in front of the entire company and demanded raises for the people who kept the lights on. She said that moment changed how she saw herself, like maybe she wasn't invisible after all. We met for lunch, and I offered her a job without even looking at her resume. I knew her already. I'd seen her work. That's how I hire now, based on effort, not polish. I speak at universities sometimes, not because I like being on stage, but because someone has to tell the next wave of engineers how to protect themselves before they end up rebuilding systems in the middle of a breakdown they didn't cause. I teach them how to read contracts, how to recognize power wrapped in politeness, and how to document everything when the compliments suddenly stop. They thank me afterward, but I always tell them the same thing. I'm not here to be admired. I'm here so you don't have to learn the hard way like I did. Vectorforge still exists. New logo, new CEO, new leadership team. They quietly phased out anything associated with Chase, erased his name from archived blog posts, scrubbed him from press releases. Calvin officially retired last spring, and I sent him a handwritten note instead of a LinkedIn comment. He replied with a folded letter and a single sentence that made me pause. It was always yours more than it was mine. That one hit harder than I expected. I haven't heard from Chase since that last email, the one where he finally apologized without trying to excuse himself. From what I gather, he's working in some generic consulting firm downtown, the kind that hires people for their last name and fires them before the end of Q3. No one calls him a visionary anymore. No one hands him microphones or investor decks. His name floats through the industry like a cautionary tale, a warning whispered between recruiters and quietly dropped during candidate screenings. I don't say anything when I hear it. I just sip my coffee and let time do what it does best. Last week, we cut the ribbon on Core's second location, a modest suite on the outskirts of Denver where 2 of my engineers were located to be closer to family. I flew in for the opening, not because I had to, but because I wanted them to see that leadership can show up without needing a round of applause. We had bagels, fruit, and one of those terrible grocery store cakes with too much icing. It was perfect. No one cried, but one of the newer hires gave a short toast that ended with, "I've never felt safer in a job before." That stayed with me longer than the champagne buzz. That night, alone in my hotel room, I thought about how many people I've worked alongside who were smarter than their titles, better than their paychecks, and still got pushed aside the second someone with more swagger walked in. I thought about all the engineers who carried infrastructure like an invisible weight while someone else took credit for their stability. I thought about the women who were told to be quiet, the veterans who were told to move on, and the interns who were never told anything at all. That's why I built J-Core, not to win, but to remember. I get asked sometimes if I'd ever go back to corporate, back to the structure, back to a place where the ceilings are glass and the walls are full of framed mission statements. The answer is always no. I don't need a corner office. I don't need a bonus I have to bleed for. I need freedom, fairness, and the ability to tell the truth without asking for permission. There's still a part of me that remembers the humiliation of sitting across from Chase while he tried to dismiss 15 years of work with a shrug. That moment never leaves you, not because it defines you, but because it reminds you what happens when you let people believe they can rewrite your story without reading it first. I remember that silence. I remember how loud it felt. And I remember choosing not to fill it with begging, but with something much more dangerous: patience. I don't tell people to be ruthless. I tell them to be ready. Contracts matter. Documentation matters. Knowing your systems inside and out matters. If someone decides to erase you, make sure they're left with a machine they don't know how to operate. I used to think vindication would come with headlines or trophies or some public declaration that I've been right all along. Turns out, vindication feels a lot quieter. It feels like waking up on a Monday without dread. It feels like building a team that doesn't need to fear silence. It feels like being seen. This morning, before logging on, I sat on the balcony of my apartment, sipped black coffee, and watched the sun hit the skyline just right. My inbox had a dozen messages waiting, most of them from clients, a few from Mints, one from a woman I'd met during a panel last year who said she finally walked away from a company that never valued her. I smiled and typed the only reply that felt right. Good. Now build something that does. And that's where I am now. Not waiting for recognition. Not demanding apologies. Just building. Every day. Brick by brick. Byte by byte. System by system. And this time, no one can take it away.